one of the biggest pieces of contentment and the biggest pieces of fame and notoriety and all those things is driven deep in our hearts is we have a desire for glory. We want glory. The question is, do we want God's glory or do we want our own? But we're wired to want glory, right? And if we can find a way to say, I want the glory of the Lord, then working hard, we can do hard work and we can do activities that are driving us towards seeing every tribe, tongue, people, and nation can do it, but we can do it with contentment and we can do it for the glory of God, because that is our responsibility.
We're talking in this podcast about the head, the heart, and the hands of the multiplying church and our leaders, and we're really leaning into the heart in these couple of episodes here and talking about what is the heart posture and the call to have a heart like a movement leader, the way that Jesus modeled, and then Paul kind of walked this out as well. So we looked at this passage in John 12 and really focusing in on not only does Jesus give this call to be a seed, a kernel of wheat that falls to the ground and dies so that it can bear much fruit, but the context here. And I think it's interesting, in verse 20, there's these Greeks that come up to the worship festival, and Philip, Andrew, they kind of pass this message on to Jesus, and his response is just it would feel kind of weird. It's like, hey, these guys want to talk to you. Unless the grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, I can by no means bear much fruit. It's just a strange response. But it's his point here is that he sees the nations coming to him. He sees the vision that the Father has given him to bring the kingdom into the whole world. And his response is to recede into the background so that much fruit can be brought forth. And he points to his own disciples then in a couple chapters later to be those that would bear much fruit. And he says there, even in John 12, that unless anyone who loves their life will lose it, whoever hates their life in this world will keep it. In other words, you're going to have to follow this same path as I do in order to bear much fruit. And this call of the kingdom is to constantly be one who is receding into the background and helping other leaders do the same so that the Father gets the glory and the task is accomplished. And so that's what we were talking about. And so in this episode, I thought we could just lean in and just talk about what does that actually look like? How do we do that? How do we embrace that kind of life? And some personal stories around that. And then just what does that bring up for us? So Dave, as you've processed that passage quite a bit in your life, I mean, practically, but then I just know theologically you kind of process through that. What does that stir up for you as you kind of think through that?
I mean, a simple response, which is not a simple response, is it's an entire, completely, utterly subversive paradigm leadership shift from the way I was completely raised in our culture of how a leader operates and what a leader's role is and how a leader actually gets influence and authority. It's completely the opposite of what we're trained to do and to be, which causes consternation every time you turn around, both in my own growth and in the life and the growth of other leaders.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this even just offline before we hit record here. Just the culture that we're in is pretty toxic in that way. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that are kind of inputting into causing us to be doing the opposite, to love our life, to use the language of Jesus here. But the outcome is that we have social media, we have celebrity culture, Hollywood, we have even you're recently in DC, we've got a whole political culture that really celebrates star power. Like you were making this point, the whole of our culture in America, and right. I would argue we have exported this to the world. It values and it emphasizes fame as the end goal of success. And so we're fighting against a whole lot that's coming at us in trying to follow this exhortation from Jesus.
Well, and I would even say, like, whenever we look, I'm raising 3 teenagers right now. And so, there's a lot of discussion on what's the role of social media in terms of teenagers' lives and how it causes so much angst and anxiety in their life because they're looking for how many likes they have, how many follows they have. Right. And all that's just based upon fame. Like, why does my 11-year-old daughter want to be a YouTube star? Well, it's not because in her heart of hearts, she's being trained by our culture to say, I want to die to myself and give myself for the life of other people. She's looking at it and she's going, oh, these guys are famous, and so I want to be famous. But, it's just so different in what Jesus is talking about, because he's like, the way in which you make yourself useful in the kingdom is the exact opposite of fame. It's becoming a nobody for the sake of others. But the question we really have to ask about what Jesus is saying is, what's our end goal? I mean, that's the real question we have to have, right? Because if our end goal is multiplication and to see more disciples raised up, then Jesus's mindset and what he's teaching us makes total sense.
Yes.
If our end goal is to be the leader of an addition movement, or to be the leader of a group of people that other people follow, then Jesus's teaching makes no sense whatsoever.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. And so I'll resonate with that personally. I think that's true in terms of just what we see in the ministry of Jesus. But I know you talked about just everything that you've been taught in becoming a follower from youth group onward, I would guess. I mean, I'll say for me, it's been youth group onward. It's about being the guy on the stage, and then there's even rankings within that of who's even more prominent and who's the next name on the circuit and who's going to come speak. There's so much emphasis on that even within Christian culture that I've experienced that probably as far back as youth group, when I wasn't even a follower of Jesus. It wasn't until college that I really began to walk with Jesus, but I was experiencing it even then. And then as I came into the church, that was the vision cast to me, was success looks like being, I mean, there's levels of it, right? So there was being a leader of a ministry. And then maybe you're the leader,
right,
you're the pastor of a church. That's like a pinnacle, right? And then even beyond that, there's those that have got notoriety in a name in different denominations or streams. Maybe that's a theological all-star, or that's a traveling evangelist. Whatever it is, I felt that, and felt that tug and that pull to focus on building something to get to that, rather than to push others forward and recede into the background.
Well, and I'll say this too, Mark, it's ironic, because whenever people are looking to leaders to help them, the words, the language they're going to use of the people that they see of leaders are those that are going to serve and help them the most. And so the ones that you're going to hear people complain about the most are the ones who are like, they're just stepping on people, they're just using people, they're just trying to go up the ladder. In organizational life or in network life or in business life, the people who are leading because they want to help a community or a culture that they're a part of. And those that are just trying to rise to the top so that they can make a name for themselves. And the truth of the matter is that, as I'll say it from a business perspective, being a part of a rather large bureaucracy and a rather large company in terms of franchise work, what I tend to find is that the people who are the worst at their job get promoted up, because the further up you go, the less you're actually involved in the day-to-day operations. And it's easier to get rid of people up than it is to get rid of people down, because the people who make the impact, make the difference, and are needed are the ones that tend to be lower in the bureaucracy chain. And everybody knows those who are going to just go up, right? You just meet them, you hear them, you watch them work, and you're just like, okay, I know who's going to go up and get the bigger titles and positions. And so the irony is, whether it be in politics, whether it be in business, whether it be in church, people know who the real leaders are. I would say it this way, like it's a super practical example, because I want to talk about not only my experience there, but also the ways we've had to die to ourselves. In some of those things. But whenever I would pastor churches, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got as a young guy who was on staffs of churches, whether it youth pastor, small groups pastor, missions, whatever. The best advice I ever got, luckily I got in my early 20s, was a pastor I was serving with said, whenever you go to a new church, the first thing you need to find is who's the pastor. And I looked at him kind of funny, and I was like, wouldn't I go as the pastor? And he said, you're never the pastor. The pastor there's a pastor of every church. And when you show up, you need to find him, and you need to make friends with him, and you need to serve him, love him, get to know him, and learn from him, because every church has a story, and every church has a pastor of that story. And every time I go into a church with that advice, after going into a couple of situations and watching that, you could go in and you could find the pastor real fast. And it would be the one during a business meeting or during a Bible study or during any type of a discussion. When a question was asked was hard, the room would pause and you just followed everybody's eyes. And they would look around the room to see how 1, 2, or 3 people are going to respond before they would respond.
Yeah.
That's the leader, right? And 9 times out of 10, there was the vocal leader that everybody treated like they were the leader because they were the loudest and they kind of just let them do their thing. But then there was the actual leader that was really quiet, really humble, and a servant that most everybody listened to. And if you ever needed to get anything done, you found that guy or that woman,
Wow.
and you worked with them to figure out what the church needed to move things forward and to understand how the culture of that church would work in terms of decision making.
Wow.
And all those things in order to do it. Some people would call that politics. But I just find that it honestly, it went along with what Jesus is saying here. Every single body I was in had that leader that everybody knew was the servant leader that they followed.
Wow, man, that's good. Yeah. So really you're framing up what that actually looks like in practice of, that this is not just, some good idea or some just challenging thing that Jesus said, but this is actually how it works. That,
I think it's practically, I think it's actually how it works, even in the business world, where you look at it and you go, oh, to move up in business, you got to be the CEO or whatever. Man, I'm in circles where I watch the person who has the title not be the leader all the time. There's a servant leader that everybody listens to.
Yeah. So I think that matters to even just highlight that point that, that this is not just some false humility thing that Jesus is saying here, but this is actually how his kingdom works. This is the reality of what it looks like to be a part of influencing the kingdom expanding. It really does look like dying and serving. That's where you have a voice in people's life. So it's good.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is that as hard as we want to say, I think on what you talked about last podcast, as easy as it sounds to go, I believe that I'm going to behave that way. The truth is that we are so ingrained to be trained to lead in the other way, to make a name for yourself, to get out front, to stand up on the stage, to have to puff yourself up in order to gain authority or influence, that the way the Lord can train us in this is first we have to choose to believe it, but then we have to submit to what the Lord's going to do in our life to actually teach us to believe this.
Wow. So let's talk about that.
Which is a scary concept.
I think everything about the actual way that Jesus lived, and not as just a moral example, but as a practical and model of how to make disciples and initiate churches and a movement, challenges this. And so as I first began to experience and read the New Testament, especially the Gospels with that lens, and this has been back in 2014, 2015, and then somewhere in there I met you and Carter and other guys, and it's really honed in to sharpen that for me. Sure. But as I started to read all of that and began to try to put that into practice in my heart, and even began to do that with people around me in the church that I was already a part of, the Legacy Church I was already part of, and to lead that in, I found out pretty quick that was bringing up stuff in me, and it was not going well in sharing that, leading that way with others. It was not well received, or it was received but then steamrolled as like foolishness or like a waste of time. And so a lot of what we are pursuing these days, Dave, is sometimes we'll call it $0 church planting, or just giving away the kingdom. And when I first heard some of this stuff and began to wrestle with it in my heart, this was the beginning of my journey of this death. And I guess maybe that's how it starts with other people, is just oh, wow, this is awesome. I want to see this outward impact. I want to do it this way that I see Jesus do this. And so I'm going to go try to implement this. And in that process, just realized that was not as popular as I thought it should be or would be. So the beginning of the death was trying to implement the words and works of Jesus in that way, in his methods in that way. And then realizing like, oh, that's actually not that easy. That is pretty hard. That's not that popular. Am I still going to stick with this? And then there was more death along the way as I did attempt to stick with it, and started to see some other people respond and begin to come into the kingdom, or other leaders to work with. But it was a time to do that again, to give it away to them, to begin to take on some of those opportunities, or to step in to lead more and more, as I stepped back to lead less and less. And I didn't realize when I started that journey how much in me wanted a name and wanted to be at the center. I just really did not realize until that began to come up, and I had to make the choice in the moment to step back and potentially have no more influence on what's happening, or no more a part of what's happening. Any of that resonate?
Let me ask this question. It does, but I'm going to ask you a probing question back after that, because knowing your journey, especially whenever the transition happened out of the legacy church and you found yourself in a Covo life, still trying to make disciples, wanting to plant churches, wanting to do all those things, but now you didn't have the organizational backing. Like during that transition, when you're moving out of the legacy church and into no titles, no organization, nothing, and still stepping out and trying to do that, what are some of those core lessons that through that season that the Lord really brought out of you? Because it was a tough season. It would be for anybody.
Yes.
I don't blame you for it being tough. It was tough for me.
Yeah.
But like, what were some of the core things that you really had to learn as you had to die to yourself in those, and you didn't have that, that title or that position or that organization to lean on anymore to get what you needed done?
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, Dave, is the Second Chronicles, I believe it is, passage. The eyes of the Lord are searching to and fro throughout the earth, looking for a heart that's completely His. And I think the first lesson I learned was whose eyes I was living before. And it wasn't the eyes of Jesus like I thought it was, or it wasn't as fully the eyes of Jesus as I thought it was. There was parts of me that was, but parts of me that was living before the eyes of men and what other people would esteem. And so I had to really almost sometimes on a daily basis, but for sure on a weekly or monthly basis, sign back up to the path that God had given me, because there were people around me who were like, what are you doing? And then I started to have friends from college or high school or whatever that I was looking and seeing getting more prominence in whatever field or career or whatever that they
sure
investing in. And that was like, that pushed all these buttons constantly of my value. And so I had to go back to like, what is my value? What is my identity? And then the other big thing I would say is just, who are my friends? Like when that happens, you kind of, I won't say you, when that happened for me, I kind of had to question like, oh, okay, the people that I thought I was with were more attached to the brand and more attached to that process of gaining influence and prominence, or that way of seeing the kingdom, quote unquote, expand, than I thought. And they're not as much friends as I thought they were. And there's still connection there, but it's just not going to look the same way I thought it did. And then friendships changed, and things begin to reorient around that commitment in my heart and life, alongside of those who were along that same journey. So relationships changed, and my view of my identity and myself changed. Those would be the two biggest things.
Yeah, I would say in our transition out of staff ministry, where I'm preaching every single week, and at the time, whenever I was doing the interim pastorate at First Baptist Church Roswell, they had a local cable station that was 24/7 playing the sermons of the church. And you're in a town of 55, 60,000 people, and you walk into Walmart and you're going to get recognized multiple times while you're in Walmart.
Yeah.
What the funny thing is that no one outside of Roswell would care or know.
Yeah.
And even people within Roswell, a lot of people didn't care, didn't know. So there was, you walk into Walmart, you're like, oh, I got recognized 3 times while I was in Walmart. Well, okay, well, there's 600 people in Walmart and 3 of them recognize you that you didn't know. That means, you have 2 ways of looking at that. That means you are like, oh, look at me. 3 people knew who I was, or there's 597 people have no idea who I am. And I think for me, when we moved to Oklahoma City and I went into business and completely kind of fell off the map, the interesting thing is that the Lord didn't allow us opportunities. And now, mind you, we tried really hard to stay inside of organizational structures within the denomination that we're a part of. We were just finding closed doors. I mean, we were showing up saying, we don't want money. We just want to give you money. And they were looking at us like, that's not how this works. And we're like, we don't want money. We just want to give. We've planted a church and our church is ready to contribute. And they were like, we don't know what to do with you. Right. And so, because the structure and the function, it just didn't connect with them on how we were doing that. And then their question is like, who's your organization? Who you with? We were just odd. We were just odd everywhere. And, the irony is that the Lord kind of took us down to, a really, really, really difficult place where the only thing that we had at that moment was each other in terms of our family and, the Lord and some hope of a possible business coming one day. But I remember when we had moved to Oklahoma City and the kids had started school, we didn't have enough money to drive our kids to school. And so we had to put them on the bus because we literally did not have enough money to put gas in our cars.
Yeah.
To go there. And I remember one particular Saturday where I was like, okay, our business was not moving forward in terms of getting started anywhere close at the pace that I had expected. And I didn't have another job and the savings that we had was now depleted. And I was sitting there going, okay, Lord, how are we going to, make this work? And our family honestly was making choices on whether or not the parents were going to eat or the children were going to have enough to eat. And so one Saturday afternoon, I just started driving around because I knew there was one thing I could do, and that is that I could preach. And so I actually went to 2 or 3 funeral homes in Oklahoma City and just said, if you have any families that don't have someone who can do their funerals for, I'd love to connect with them. And I knew that I could make connections with families, but I also knew that they would give me a couple $100 or $250 to preach a funeral for them. And I could make a little extra cash. And that sounds terrible, right? Like, oh yeah, you're going to do some funerals for people just to make money off of families. But Mark, I was at the point where I was like, if I don't have, we needed money.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like we didn't have, like, I'm trying to buy groceries for the family.
Yeah.
And so, long story short, the Lord opened up an opportunity for me to deliver appliances. I installed washing machines and dryers and dishwashers and treadmills and things for a former student of mine who I was his youth pastor, and he had a Sears business that he'd opened. He needed somebody to just do part-time delivery. So I started delivering and installing appliances for him just to have a part-time job while we were waiting for our other, a store stuff to get off the ground. Yeah. And to say that my identity was challenged in that season, that was an understatement, because I went from being the pastor of a First Baptist church in a large and influential church in the corner of New Mexico to now I'm installing washers and dryers and digging crap out of the walls of people's houses. Right. Yeah, that was a dying to self season. And I found in my heart during that season that I had put so much trust and so much of my faith in the position, in the education, in the pillars that I was standing on, that I was using those instead of Jesus to get the job done. And I'll be honest, in that season, the Lord was like, you're going to have to die to yourself. And it was hard.
Wow.
It was really hard, not only for me, but also for my wife, because about 2 to 3 years later, my wife and I had a lot of struggles in our marriage. And those marriage struggles were because I had made that transition in my identity, but she hadn't yet made that transition in her identity of being married to the guy who was up front every week. And she had to be okay with being married to a guy who she couldn't sit and say, that's my husband to anymore. Because now we feel like, what does your husband do? Well, he's a dry cleaner, going to be a dry cleaner, and he installs treadmills. Like, there's not a whole lot of pride that a wife can, puff up and say, look at my husband, and those things. And so my wife struggled. with those concepts as well. It was a tough season.
Yes. Yeah. And I know, Dave, just from knowing your story and watching you in the day to day, that continues as you have a business and you have those that you're discipling working alongside of you and leading in the church with ICC. How has that continued for you? What does that process look like in more recent years?
Well, I would say I'm almost I'm 8 years in now, and I don't have any of the network connections that I had before. In terms of, I still have relationships, and I still have some pieces. But if I can walk in and I can say, my name is Dr. Dave Miller, and I'm pastor of X Church, that gives me automatic entrance, influence, and sway in certain cultures, in certain circles.
Right.
Yeah. And you can get things moving forward a lot faster.
Right.
And I think the hardest part of it now is the patience and the slowness of not having those pieces be the way in which you move forward. And I would say it this way: in the business world, I don't make any sense because I do church planting. In the church planting world, I don't make a whole lot of sense because I do business. And so there's never really a platform for me to stand on anymore that allows me to have a position or a title or an explanation of what I do that makes the person standing across from me or working with me automatically understand who I am, be able to put a stereotypical box on me, and then decide whether or not they're going to trust or not trust me, which means my relationship skills have had to just skyrocket in terms of understanding that you said, who are my true friends? I have found that relationships with brothers and sisters in the Lord that are based upon the mission and based upon Christ have become the bedrock of everything that I do, because none of those other things are understandable to other people. I'm just a weirdo all the time. Like, people are like, what do you do? How do you do that? When do you, what, who are you? So I don't fit a box that allows them to give me automatic trust. And so I have to trust that the Lord, knits together the right relationships to move things forward.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you.
I will say one last thing about that. I think that's what the falls to the ground and dies and produces fruit. I think that's what happens, because my web of deep, strong relationships based upon mission is exponentially grown than my days when I was in the pastorate.
Wow. That's good. Yeah, I think the falling to the ground and dying in this recent season for me has looked like the Lord confronting idolatry in my heart. And the way that he said it to me in a recent, we just took a trip and we're just getting some time away, and a lot of it was actually pretty hard. It wasn't super restful, but in the midst of just experiencing all of this stuff, I felt like the Lord said to me, you have a worship gap in your life, Mark. And I was like, that's a weird phrase. What does that mean? And I felt like God was highlighting to me that there's a gap in worship. And the first time worship's mentioned in the Bible, it's when Abraham's going up on the mountain with Isaac. It's a putting him on the altar. It's like laying down the things that God's given him by putting it on the altar and entrusting it fully over this promise that he would be the father of many nations, literally putting his son on the altar. And I felt like the Lord said, you have a worship gap, and you're worshiping and you're focused on all these things you think you deserve, these positions you think you deserve, all this stuff you think you deserve. And it's created a gap in you where the enemy can come and do all this havoc. He's just doing havoc in my internal life, and then it's translating into relationships because of what I am jealous or envious or whatever with other people. And it's causing me to go back to, okay, so what do you want me to do, Lord? And he's inviting me to go back and lay it on the altar, lay myself on the altar again, and through worship get back to that place of agreeing with what he says. So here, Jesus, he's being the seed that falls to the ground that dies. He's literally about to go to the altar, and I feel like that's. I
don't think there's a stronger example than Jesus, right?
Yes. So that what is the invitation of Jesus, and that parallel to what happened there with Abraham and Isaac, that's called the first time of worship. And I feel like the Lord said, yeah, it's time to get your worship right. You've got things disordered in your heart. Get back to right worship. And so it's just caused me to go through repentance again in this season and say, Lord, I don't want to assume what my role looks like. And so roles look different in different circles and different seasons and all of that. But I'm just finding, unless I continue to revisit that in my heart and lay that down to the Lord, I'm going to cling on to a position, to a name, to a whatever, and become the one that's inhibiting the advancement of the kingdom. And so it's been a place of repentance for me, and just a really like raw, vulnerable place recently.
The irony for me about all of this, Mark, is whenever I was in a position in my life, in different circles, at different times in my life, I have found myself with some notoriety, influence, fame, if you want to use that word. I've been on stages with, 30,000 people watching me at occasions in my life, right? At 18, 19 years old, I found myself in a convention center in downtown Oklahoma City speaking to 25, 30,000 people. And at other times I've been in rooms where the who's who of certain organizations are, making decisions that are going to alter the effect of large Protestant denominations. And I sit in the room with multi-billion-dollar company executives on occasions in my life.
Yes.
And here's the thing for me that has been the most ironic of all those things. None of the people in each of those circles know anything about the famous people in each of those circles. So if I'm in the executive circle, they have no idea about the denominational leadership. And if I was to use their names, they'd be like, who's that? And I was like, oh, they do X, Y, and Z. They're with this organization. They'd be like, what organization is that? Was that like a church thing? Right? Yeah. What denomination? What's a denomination? Like what, who, what? And if I go to the church circle and I tell them about the names of the executives in corporations, they'd be like, who's that? And they're like upper echelon, like people want to be around them, want to talk to them in those circles. And then if I was to go to the third circle back whenever I was 18, 19 years old, that was 25, 30 years ago. And now, like, I was in Washington, D.C. this past week with my family. And that organization that I was a part of was FFA. I was huge into Future Farmers of America. Yeah, I was huge. Wearing the blue corduroy jacket, man. I was an ag country boy growing up. That's who I was. And there's this conference called Washington Leadership Conference. I went to it in 1996. Okay, that's a long time ago. And while we were in Washington, D.C. this past week celebrating my mom and dad's 50th wedding anniversary, Washington Leadership Conference was happening. And there were FFA members all over, right, Washington. And I went up and talked to a few of them, and I had a good time talking to them. But it was funny because I laughed. I'm that old guy that came up and talked to them about back whenever I got to do Washington Leadership Conference. And it's a great memory for me, but I'm just a nobody to them. I'm just some weird rando guy that now has a father figure, which some people call a dad bod, that's walking up to them with his kids and, his mom and dad has a camera. And I was something, right? Whenever I went in 1996, like there was things that I did that was something to that crowd. It doesn't matter anymore. They don't even know. And it's just that all of this is to simply say the dying to myself, the one thing that I have loved more than anything else about that hard season, which I'm like you, I'm not going to play it down. It hurt. It was like straight up surgery without any anesthesia.
Yeah.
Right. Is I found contentment. Yeah. And I have been searching for that my entire life. I remember when I was in seminary and I was working a night shift at UPS, and I was driving down the ramp at 4 a.m. in the morning because I had just gotten off my shift. And I was listening to Philippians to and from work because I was like, Lord, I want to run this race and I want to see all the things that you talk about. And whenever I will never forget it, as I was driving down the exit ramp on my way back home from work, he took me to that passage where we all love it, where we're going to go towards the resurrection and we're going to have all the things that Paul talks about. But he says he gets to the resurrection through the sufferings of Christ. And I'm sitting there listening to Philippians 3, and the Lord said, the way in which you get there is through suffering. Like, you have to go down to bring to life the things that I want. Same concept that you're talking about. And I asked a very simple question: what does ambition look like in the kingdom? And I'll never forget going down that exit ramp. And I was like, Lord, what is the difference between ambition and selfish ambition? And here I am 20 years later, and I realized that the biggest difference between ambition and selfish ambition is very simple. Selfish ambition has everything to do with me. Ambition has everything to do with him. And if I want to live out his ambition, then that means what you just said. I completely die to myself. I give up my dreams. I give up my path. I give up my future, which is so hard to do. And I just say, okay, Lord, I trust you. And I'm ambitious for whatever you, the chief strategist and Lord and King, want to do with my life. And the irony is, Mark, true irony is that whenever I finally got to the place where I was cool with that, and I believed that that's what I really wanted, and the Lord trained me to do that, I finally found contentment, right? Where I'm actually like, I'm happy and thankful for where he has me. Is that my response every day, to every moment, to everything? No, right? I get really upset at the places where I still find that my selfish ambition is rooted in my heart.
Yeah.
But I'm more content now than I've ever been in any other time in my life. And I have young people around me who are constantly in consternation, wanting more, wanting more, wanting more, wanting more. And I'm like, just trust the Lord to write your story. Just trust him. You keep doing the work and let him write the story, because it's his story anyway, you know?
Amen. Man, I don't know what else to add to that. That's a good word, Dave. Thank you for unpacking part of your journey and just being transparent in that. I think that
you as well.
As we do this, I think there's a lot of people that need to hear this. So whoever might listen to this, I think this is not the message that is of our culture, as we highlighted, but it's also not the message of the missions world of the church, unfortunately, super often. It's out there, but it's just not always the emphasized thing. And so I think this is important.
Well, and I will say that because it's a nobody discussion, that's the reason it's not emphasized, is because the people who are living it are the ones who just have their hands to the plow and are getting the job done. And I mean, there's a remnant. There's thousands and thousands of men and women of God who understand this and are living this. And we just don't know who they are, but they're getting the job done, you know? And that's what really matters. I want to ask you one question before we go. How has this journey in this season of what the Lord's done with you been important for you when you moved to New York and just got dropped into a sea of just, people where you basically are overwhelmed? And I'm going to really encourage you here. You became a nobody on top of a nobody in the middle of a sea of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right.
How's this been important for you?
It's important because first of all, yes, I resonate with what you're saying. It's incredibly humbling to come here, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, to come to New York City. New York doesn't care who you are, what your name is, what you've done. You've got to scramble to build a bigger name, or what. That's kind of the ethos of the city. And so it's definitely in the air here. But yeah, to come here, what it's done for me is it's causing all this stuff to come to the surface, and it's driving me to cling to Jesus and to cling to the gospel more and to preach the gospel to myself, really, ultimately, because I think there were places where I didn't realize how much I was buying into that world path that Jesus is rejecting there in John 12. So yeah, I think day after day after day, as I go out into the city, but then also as I'm interfacing and connecting with some of the people I'm meeting in the existing church, I feel that challenge to die again in each one of those interactions.
It is a scary proposition, and it requires faith at every single turn, because to live this kind of a lifestyle requires you to really trust that when God promises something, he will keep his promises. And not in the big things, in the very small everyday things when no one else is looking and you're having panic attacks about I could do certain things the way the world's taught me, and I could solve this problem. But to step back and say, Lord, this is what you said, this is what you promised, and I will behave accordingly, and get looked at like a fool is a very hard position to be in. I'm going to read one thing out of Genesis that the Lord just really brought to my attention yesterday morning. Because I just restarted the Bible at the beginning of July. And the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15, he took him outside and he said, look at the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. So here's the promise. Your offspring will be as numerous as the stars. That's the promise. Abraham believed him and God called him righteous because of that belief.
All right.
In Genesis 18, listen to what God says as he's speaking through one of the angels in the Sodom and Gomorrah saga. Abraham is to become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will command his children and his house after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. This is how the Lord will fulfill to Abraham what he promised him. And that verse really stuck out to me, where it's like, how is the Lord going to fulfill the promise? The promise is guaranteed because God gave it.
Yes.
The promise is believed by Abraham, but the way in which the Lord will fulfill the promise is because Abraham is going to command his children and his house after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and what is just.
Wow.
And I think oftentimes we want to sit back and go, God promised this, and now all I do is just sit back and enjoy the promises of God. But the promises of God come with responsibility.
Yes.
So when God promises us in the Great Commission that every tribe, tongue, people, and nation are the goal of what we're going to do, that promise that the nations will come to him requires my responsibility in believing that promise, that my activities match what I believe God is going to do. And it doesn't mean that God's going to do it without me. It means that God's going to do it with us.
Yeah.
That these things flow. And I think one of the biggest pieces of contentment and the biggest pieces of fame and notoriety and all those things is driven deep in our hearts is we have a desire for glory. We want glory. The question is, do we want God's glory or do we want our own? But we're wired to want glory, right? And if we can find a way to say, I want the glory of the Lord, then working hard, we can do hard work and we can do activities that are driving us towards seeing every tribe, tongue, people, and nation can do it, but we can do it with contentment and we can do it for the glory of God, because that is our responsibility. And so one of the other pitfalls of this discussion is we get to the place where we're like, okay, I'm just going to die to myself. And we think that dying to ourselves means that we just quit. It doesn't mean we just quit. It just means that we quit trying to be the one that everybody sees while we're doing it. We put our hands to the plow. We trust the promises of God and we work because he promised.
Yeah, that's good.
Right. I think it still goes back to that. It's a we question. We as the church, not me as David, but we as the church follow Jesus together.
Amen.